The story begins with an enemy dashing forward, executing a flawless stab with his sword aimed at the protagonist, Incrid. It is the tip of the blade he has seen 17 times before. Incrid closes his eyes and experiences his 17th death. He wonders, if he had wielded his sword with just a bit more effort, if he had trained a little harder, perhaps he wouldn't have met his end here. In the depths of darkness, a mysterious creature, perched on a boat and holding a lamp, questions him. Does he truly believe that? The creature urges him to struggle, to experience it fully, and then to surrender, to embrace the despair of facing an insurmountable wall. Yet, instead of yielding, Incrid's expression twists with frustration, unwilling to accept defeat. One morning, the sound of pans and ladles clanging echoed through the air, jolting Incrid and the others awake. Among them, a long-haired man named Rem, who was in the middle of putting on his boots, took notice. Incrid, their squad commander, had woken up immediately today. Without hesitation, Incrid casually remarked that there were bugs in Rem's boots. Startled, Rem quickly checked, shaking his boots until a bug tumbled out. Without a second thought, someone crushed it underfoot. Turning to Incrid, Rem narrowed his eyes and demanded to know if he had put the bug there, calling it a ridiculous prank. But Incrid simply shrugged and replied that he had only seen it crawl in earlier. This was the 18th time Incrid had seen that bug's corpse. He wondered, if he saw it a few more times, would he finally reach the end of this day? Incrid had wielded a sword since childhood. He had learned swordsmanship from a retired mercenary who had wandered into his village by chance. The mercenary, impressed by his skill, had praised him, saying that if he was already this talented, he could one day become a knight. And so, he began to dream. He envisioned himself as a knight, one who could cut down 1,000 enemies single-handedly, someone capable of shifting the tide of battle, an invincible hero. He believed he was the protagonist of the ballad sung by a wandering minstrel. A group of mercenaries laughed, raising their beers as they recalled the rookie's fall earlier. They mocked the coward who had once trembled before a mere stray dog yet dared to dream of becoming a knight. To them, he wasn't even fit to be a wandering mercenary. Incrid, who had left his village to join a mercenary corps, soon realized that his so-called talent might not be anything special. But he believed it was far too soon to give up after a single failure. Hard work, after all, never betrays those who persevere. If he wasn't naturally gifted, then with time and effort, he was certain he could overcome his shortcomings. And for a while, it seemed true. He gained experience. He built the strength and endurance to earn the acknowledgement of those around him. But that hope began to crumble. In the village where he was stationed, a child challenged him to a duel. The boy was only 12 years old and had been training with a sword for just 6 months. Yet, despite all the years Incrid had spent wielding a blade, despite the calloused, wrecked hands that bore testament to his dedication, he found himself utterly outclassed. A fool who had devoted over a decade to the sword was still nothing compared to a genius in just 6 months. He wanted to become a knight. Everyone mocked him, calling it a hopeless dream. But he refused to give up. By sacrificing sleep, cutting down on meals, and dedicating every spare moment to swinging his sword, again and again, he believed that even if he could never become a knight, at the very least, he could become an experienced soldier. 3 years later. The present. The Cyprus Division, 4 companies, each with 4 platoons, each platoon divided into 4 squads. Through relentless effort, Incrid had climbed his way up to become the squad commander of a so-called second-rate squad. It was the highest position he could reach after years of endless training. Still, being a regular soldier of the kingdom was better than wandering as a mercenary. Incrid called Jackson, one of his squad members, and ordered him to take over his morning duty rotation for the day. Without complaint, Jackson agreed, telling Incrid to repay him next time before standing up to carry out the task. Noticing the way Jackson stared at Incrid, Rem labeled him a wicked, wild, cat-like bastard. When Incrid called Rem's name, Rem immediately questioned whether he was about to be assigned a task as well. Instead, Incrid mentioned Heart of the Beast and shared his desire to learn it again. Rem smiled and reminded him that he had given up on mastering it last time, then asked if he truly believed it would work now. The close combat battle between Naulilia and Aspen began once more. Incrid died in this battle, only to come back to life, reliving the same day over and over again. Each time he returned, he learned Heart of the Beast from Rem. Yet, no matter how many times he trained, he still couldn't see the tip of the sword that stabbed him. This was his 21st time on this battlefield. He had completely memorized every repeating event. The spear coming from behind, dodge it. Next, an attack from the enemy at his back, counter it. And then, Vel, one of his squad members, died. But this time, knowing what would happen, Incrid changed Vel's fate, blocking the incoming arrow. However, Vel lost focus, allowing an enemy to leap at him, sword poised to strike. Luckily, he was saved again. It worked. Even though Incrid managed to block the first arrow, he was immediately killed afterward, but he had accomplished his first goal for the day. Now, what remained was facing him once again. No matter how many times this day repeated, Incrid always ended up confronting that bastard. The one who had stabbed his neck and killed him 20 times. This time, he swore he would survive. Incrid recalled Rem's words. Since he always closed his eyes in dangerous situations, doing so on the battlefield would mean instant death. Rem had advised him to be brave, to stay composed, and to never be easily agitated or shaken. Instead, he had to become someone who knew nothing of fear, nothing of death. Like a beast. That was Heart of the Beast. Incrid pictured a creature that knew no death, then questioned himself, was he afraid of dying? No. If anything, he believed that death only made him stronger. For the first time. On his 21st attempt, Incrid dodged the enemy's stab. But it didn't last. After missing the first strike, the enemy quickly followed up with another, piercing him once more, eliminating him. Trapped in this never-ending day, he had endured pain, despair, and death. A mysterious creature urged him to give up, to step onto the boat, to accept his weakness and find peace. But Incrid refused. With fury in his eyes and a voice filled with defiance, he declared that such a day would never come. And then, he saw it. For the first time, he laid eyes on the tip of the enemy's sword. And he dodged it. One step at a time, he was moving forward. On his 22nd day, he would challenge it again. The battle raged on. This was the 33rd time Incrid had tried to overcome the wall before him. He could see it clearly now, the tip of the enemy's sword rushing toward him. He moved to dodge before it could reach him, but it wasn't enough. The enemy was still too fast. Once again, he failed to overcome the day. Once again, he died. As his body slowly collapsed to the ground, the tie of his necklace snapped. The necklace slipped from his neck, falling beside him in the dirt. During his time as a mercenary, Incrid occasionally accepted requests to subjugate monsters. It was not out of obligation but rather by chance. He would stumble upon a village in need and be asked for assistance. His decision to help stemmed from his dream of becoming a knight, as protecting the weak was a knight's duty. One day, an old man wearing a hood approached Incrid and explained that their village was poor and could only offer him a charm as compensation. In his mind, Incrid found the reward laughable, considering the risk to his life. However, the old man assured him that the charm would grant him what he most desperately prayed for. Back in the present, as Incrid lay on the ground awaiting death, he looked at the charm and wondered if it was the reason today kept repeating, forcing him to relive this moment just so he could become a knight. His enemy slowly approached, gazing down at him. "You must be in pain," the enemy murmured before raising a weapon. "Here's some mercy." Incrid stared at his opponent's face, his thoughts filled with scorn. What he was about to do was not mercy. To Incrid, this man was nothing more than a sadist who found pleasure in stabbing others. Another day began with the clanging of a pan to wake everyone up. Incrid told Rem that he had placed an insect in his boot. Annoyed by Incrid's pranks so early in the day, Rem grew irritated and questioned whether Incrid had finally lost his mind. However, Incrid simply dismissed his concerns, urging him to stop talking and come outside to teach him the heart of the beast. The training session began, and Incrid successfully evaded Rem's attacks. As they rested, Rem eyed him curiously and asked what he had been doing. How had the skin of his heart suddenly grown so much tougher? Incrid replied that he had been training. However, Rem remained unconvinced, pointing out that such progress shouldn't happen so quickly. This had already happened more than 10 times. As Rem had said, it was a sensation Incrid had learned from facing death. Rem insisted that there was no way his family's secret technique could be passed on to another person. In response, Incrid questioned why it was so important and casually suggested that perhaps he had learned it by chance. He then challenged Rem to another round of sparring, to which Rem gladly agreed. Even if Incrid had grasped the heart of the beast, he would be as good as dead if he couldn't land a strike. However, rather than attacking, he continued to evade Rem's blows. Growing impatient, Rem demanded to know how long he planned to keep dodging. At present, the only sword technique Incrid possessed was the Valen mercenary sword technique, an unorthodox style created by a mercenary known as Valen. Many spoke ill of it, dismissing it as nothing more than a petty trick. Yet, among all the techniques Incrid had at his disposal, this was the most reliable one. Incrid stepped back and prepared to attack Rem, attempting to imitate Valen's posture and the way he delivered his stabbing technique. However, Rem easily deflected the strike and knocked the sword from Incrid's hand. Determined, Incrid tried once more to replicate Valen's stab. Having died to that very attack more than 10 times, his body instinctively remembered it. Scratching his head, Rem remarked that Incrid's attack should have carried more weight. Among everything Incrid had shown him so far, that stab had been the most promising. Rem then demonstrated how the technique should be executed. With the right impact, Incrid's hand should have bled from the force. He also pointed out that Incrid was too hesitant, doubting himself too much. With a serious gaze, Incrid declared that this attack couldn't fail. But if it were blocked, he asked Rem what his next move should be. Rem smirked and told him, "Just think, I can't dodge that. And say, you're dead meat now. That way, you won't lose your grip on your sword." Although Rem's explanation was somewhat vague, Incrid understood what he meant. The difference between Incrid's stab and that bastard's stab was clear. Incrid lacked confidence in his sword. He needed to stab with the intent to kill. Step by step, he advanced. No. Even if it was just a quarter of a step, he would move forward. On the 111th day. On the 123rd day. And finally, on the 124th day. With determination in his eyes and a fierce shout, Incrid exerted all his strength to execute the sword-stabbing technique. Observing this, Rem wiped away a bead of sweat and asked if he had gone insane. Incrid's hands were worn out, blood gushing from his wounds. Yet, despite the pain, he laughed like a madman. At last, he had mastered that perverted bastard's stab. He tried it a little faster, driven by pure murderous intent. His first attempt at the stab was a failure. Yet, he did not blink, nor did he loosen his grip on his sword. Every moment flashed through his mind, the countless clashes of their blades, leading up to this very strike. As the enemy stepped on Incrid, ready to eliminate him, Incrid spoke with unwavering resolve. "Tomorrow, you're going to die." But his enemy merely smiled and replied, "The dead have no tomorrow." The day began once more with Incrid stepping on a bug that had crawled out of Rem's boots. He informed Rem that he had seen the insect scurrying inside earlier. In response, Rem thanked him. Incrid then remarked that if Rem was truly grateful, he should take over his guard duty. Hearing this, Rem couldn't help but wonder why Incrid was ordering him around so casually. It was the 125th day. Outside, Incrid called out to the big-eyed man and ordered him to bring armor, a shield, and a dagger, assuring him that he would pay for them later. The big-eyed man agreed, stating that he trusted Incrid because he was the boss. Rem then questioned whether the squad commander had always been this forceful with his commands. In response, the long-haired man sitting beside him remarked that it was because Rem constantly pushed his tasks onto Incrid. Feeling insulted, Rem shot back, asking if the long-haired man wanted to taste his axe. Moments later, the other squad members emerged from their tents, murmuring among themselves. They observed that their squad leader was behaving strangely today, noting that he was not usually this intense. Incrid felt an unbearable amount of pain each time he died. He questioned whether, after thousands of attempts, he would ever succeed. If he managed to find a way to escape and survive, would he wake up to tomorrow? Or would he still awaken to this same day? He was stronger now than he had been before, but he wondered if it was enough to be content with that. Dismissing the thought, he reminded himself that complacency was not an option. He had to surpass this obstacle and learn how to strike with precision. Determined, he resolved not to abandon this so-called blessing. No matter what, he had to keep moving forward. Incrid, a man with no special skills, managed to survive this battle through 3 key factors: preparation, luck, and a calm mind. On the 46th day, his left shoulder was shattered by a spiked mace. On the 47th day, he rolled to dodge the same weapon, only to have his head crushed by another attacker. He adapted by adding a spin to his movements, striking the enemy first. On the 71st day, a soldier struck from below, severing his foot, leaving him helpless against the stabbing maniac. On the 89th day, his head was split open when someone hurled an axe at him. Incrid realized that if he allowed this particular enemy to live, the man would interfere with his battle against the stabbing maniac. Letting him live was simply not an option. Incrid had trained extensively in throwing weapons throughout his countless repeated days, so executing the technique was effortless. However, despite all his preparation, Vel ended up right behind him. A sharpshooter known as the Claw of the Hawk approached. Incrid had no time to deal with him. His focus was on the true challenge ahead. It was time for him to face the wall. Dodging and stabbing alone would not grant him victory. He needed something more. His opponent was merely a regular soldier, yet he possessed remarkable strength, almost at the level of a prodigy. However, his lack of real combat experience made him easy to catch off guard. The Valen mercenary sword technique, with its numerous variations, proved highly effective against him. By now, Incrid had mastered every detail of the enemy's signature stab. Their blades clashed, and in an instant, the enemy's sword shattered into pieces. Meanwhile, an enemy fired an arrow toward Incrid's location. Believing he had already won, Incrid remained unaware of the projectile descending from above. Fortunately, a thrown axe intercepted the arrow midair, saving him at the last moment. At the same time, his sword finally reached the perverted bastard, delivering a lethal strike. Rem shouted that he was going to take down that Claw of the Hawk bastard, but his ally stopped him, saying it was too late and not to waste his energy. Incrid stood drenched in sweat, his breathing heavy as he slowly regained his composure. He then approached the perverted bastard, raised his sword, and with cold finality said, "This is mercy." With that, he finished him off. At last, Incrid had broken through the wall. But just then, a frog warrior hurled something at his back, knocking him to the ground. Rem spotted the attacker and immediately rushed to help Incrid. The frog warrior approached Incrid and stated that he had invested significantly in raising the perverted bastard. He could not believe that someone like Incrid had defeated him. Just as the frog warrior was about to finish off the suffering Incrid, Rem arrived and deflected his attack with his axe. The frog warrior and Rem then engaged in close combat, exchanging blows. While they were locked in battle, an enemy soldier attempted to stab Incrid. However, at the last moment, another ally arrived and swiftly eliminated the threat, ensuring Incrid's safety. Rem and the frog warrior fought on equal footing. As they put some distance between them, Rem told the frog warrior that if he intended to cut off their squad commander's head, he would need Rem's permission first. The frog warrior was surprised to learn that the weakling he had wanted to kill was actually the squad commander, not Rem. In Rem's mind, he acknowledged that his opponent belonged to a warrior race, frogs born to fight. He realized that his only options were to burn the frog warrior with magic or pierce his heart in a single strike, both of which he found troublesome. Resolving himself, Rem decided he would have to put his life on the line. However, the frog warrior deemed the battle unworthy of his efforts and turned his back on Rem to retreat. Seeing this, Rem called him a coward. Meanwhile, the other squad members continued to eliminate the remaining enemies. A red-haired man carried Incrid on his back while the others protected them. Moments later, the enemy forces began to retreat. As Incrid closed his eyes, his consciousness was transported to a different dimension. There, an unknown creature addressed him, stating that he had managed to survive for a day, but that was all. The creature went on to say that Incrid would not be able to withstand the countless obstacles that would continue to appear before him. His fate, the creature claimed, was to fall into despair and eventually give up. However, Incrid slowly stood up and declared that, to him, those obstacles existed only to be overcome. The unknown creature smiled and said that he would be eagerly waiting for the moment when Incrid's eyes, once filled with greed and ambition, were completely stripped of their light. When Incrid woke up, He was already in bed, his injuries having been treated. The place felt familiar, and a voice beside him confirmed that it was the infirmary tent. It was Rem, a member of the 4th Squad, who remarked that Incrid had no trouble sleeping for 2 days straight. He also reminded Incrid that he had saved him from the frog. As Incrid slowly sat up, a sharp pain coursed through his body. Rem explained that none of his bones were broken, but his head had been badly shaken. He then asked if Incrid remembered him, his best friend forever. Incrid responded bluntly, stating that he had never called Rem a friend and instead addressed him as a noble hunter. At that, Rem abruptly covered Incrid's mouth and ordered him to stay quiet. He warned that just because it was someone else's secret, one that had nothing to do with Incrid, it did not mean he could simply blurt it out. Unfazed, Incrid posed a question of his own. Was he truly someone Rem had nothing to do with, or was he his so-called best friend? He advised Rem to pick one. A new day had arrived, extending beyond the trials of yesterday. Incrid had survived. Cries, a member of the 4th Squad, informed his commander that he had spent a great deal to get Incrid there and demanded repayment, 3 times over. Incrid couldn't help but wonder why a mere soldier like himself, who would typically be left to fend for his own survival, had ended up in the infirmary tent. Just then, Jackson, another member of the 4th Squad, stepped forward. Incrid eyed him and asked if he had business with him, urging him to speak up. Without a word, Jackson tossed a small container of ointment toward him and offered brief instructions on how to apply it. Incrid recognized it immediately. It was the very ointment Jackson always used, and he was known for hating to share personal items. Meanwhile, Auden, another squad member, knelt beside Incrid, praying and crying. Irritated, Incrid told him to leave. He wasn't dead, after all. As night fell, Incrid, still lying in bed, wondered about the reason behind his squad members taking shifts. After all this time, when they had been free to do as they pleased, he couldn't help but question if their actions were driven by concern for him. Moments later, another squad member, Ragna, appeared before Incrid and asked why he was in the infirmary. However, without waiting for a response, Ragna turned his back and left. Incrid closed his eyes and, in his mind, dismissed the idea of Ragna being concerned, thinking to himself that there was no way the rascal cared. He never had. Besides Incrid, there were 2 other soldiers in the infirmary tent. One was a platoon commander from a different company, a man who had often picked fights with Incrid in the past. The other was a soldier whose name Incrid didn't know, a quiet figure who spent his time staring off into space. He seemed like a low-ranking soldier, and Incrid couldn't help but wonder how he ended up there. Moments later, an elf warrior entered the tent and asked who the commander of the 444th Squad was. The elf warrior, also referred to as a fairy, approached one of the men and asked which group he belonged to. The soldier responded by introducing himself as Vengeance, the commander of the 3rd platoon in the 2nd company. The fairy immediately scolded him, asking if his company had failed to teach him the proper etiquette of stating his race when addressing a superior. Realizing his mistake, Vengeance quickly apologized. Upon hearing the fairy's words, Incrid suddenly recognized her. She was the new commander of the 4th company. Without hesitation, he introduced himself by name and stated his position as the commander of the 4th Squad, within the 4th company and 4th platoon. The fairy acknowledged his introduction with a slight nod and remarked that she had heard he was managing his difficult squad members well. She then added that she looked forward to his contributions. In the back of his mind, Incrid couldn't help but wonder if she had come all this way just to say that. As the fairy was about to leave, she stopped and asked for the other man's name. He hesitated, seeming to search for a suitable response, before finally saying his name was Krang. Incrid wondered if he had simply made that up. His behavior in front of the company commander had been disrespectful as well, making Incrid question whether he was truly a noble. Without offering a response, the fairy departed. Incrid flexed his arm, opening and closing his hand, and noticed that most of the pain had faded. He could now exert strength in his body again, which meant it was time to resume training. The Vengeance soldier noticed Incrid preparing to leave and asked where he was going. Incrid replied that he was heading to the training area. In response, the Vengeance soldier scoffed, calling him an idiot for acting tough despite being the lowest-ranking soldier. Incrid needed to recall the past battle. It was one of the few useful methods he had spent a great deal of money learning in his youth. He remembered the final stab at the last moment and wondered, what if that last-ditch attack had failed? The thought made him realize that relying entirely on a single move was a dangerous gamble. If that attack failed, he would die. His mind then drifted to Rem's axe attacks, all of them lethal. He contemplated how he would adjust his strategy for the next fight. But before he could think further, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You're working hard," someone remarked. It was Krang, sitting beside him. Krang had been watching him and couldn't help but wonder what Incrid was doing. First, his hands had kept twitching in the barracks, and now he was out here, lost in thought. Incrid explained that he was training his grip strength and replicating the battle in his mind. Krang raised an eyebrow. "And why are you doing that?" "So I don't get killed," Incrid replied bluntly. Krang smirked and asked, "Are you trying to become something by preserving your life?" What Incrid wanted to become was his dream. Yet, whenever he said it out loud, people only laughed at him. It was a dream he had already fulfilled in some small way despite his meager talent. But still, a dream he had never stopped yearning to achieve. A knight. Krang was momentarily speechless after hearing Incrid's words. Seeing his reaction, Incrid remarked that this was the first time someone hadn't laughed at him. Krang remained silent for a moment before finally speaking. "I just remembered something," he murmured. Watching Incrid, he suddenly understood what he needed to do. As Krang slowly walked away, he stopped briefly and turned back. "If you ever become a knight," he said, "remember my name, friend." For the first time, Incrid felt what it was like to be supported. After waking up to the sound of the wandering minstrel and waiting for the delayed breakfast, Incrid decided to take a short, leisurely walk instead of heading to the training area. He spent the day doing nothing, preferring to sleep early rather than engage in his usual activities. The next morning, Incrid woke up to the same noises he had heard the previous day. He noticed that the person beside him was being excessively loud and repeating the same things as before. Suddenly, it hit him, he wondered if he had died. Incrid stepped outside and spoke with Jackson. After hearing Jackson's words, he became certain that it was the same day as yesterday. It dawned on him that, while he had been sleeping, he had died without even realizing it. He had passed away more hopelessly than when he had been stabbed. Despite feeling like utter crap, this realization only strengthened his resolve. It was another challenge to overcome. While lying in bed, Incrid pondered who might have killed him and how they had managed to do so. The enemy would have needed to bypass all the defenses to reach him, which seemed only possible for knights. However, this seemed unlikely, so Incrid considered the possibility of a hidden assassin, someone among them. They would have knowledge of the medical barracks location and the ability to conceal their presence. His thoughts turned to someone skilled in assassinations, and he soon fixated on the fairy. Incrid believed that the fairy's quiet, nimble feet made her ideal for such a task. He wondered if the reason the fairy had visited that day was to scout the location in advance. To confirm his suspicions, Incrid realized he needed to witness it firsthand. There was only one entrance to the medical barracks. Incrid devised a plan. If he saw her, he could scream to alert the other soldiers. All he had to do now was wait for the assassin. Moments later, Incrid felt a sharp pain as a poisonous needle struck his neck. He hadn't even seen the assassin approach. His body was paralyzed, and he was unable to speak. The poison was potent, numbing him completely. As his thoughts swirled, he wondered if this was the reason he had died without understanding how. Platoon Commander Vengeance had also been struck by a poisonous needle to the neck. Incrid turned his head with great difficulty and saw the assassin standing beside Krang's bed. The assassin raised a sword, then plunged it into the sleeping Krang, ending his life in an instant. Before Incrid could fully process the scene, a sword sliced through the tent, and another figure emerged, another assassin, or so Incrid thought. As the figure stepped forward, he noticed the pointed ears beneath the hood and the delicate hand gripping the weapon. It was unmistakable. It was a fairy. Incrid's suspicions were confirmed. The company leader was behind it all. The same morning, 3 times in a row, Incrid remained on high alert, yet he couldn't detect the enemy's presence. He knew this wouldn't be easy. His thoughts drifted to the company commander, someone far more dangerous. Even if he managed to stop the assassins, he would have to face her immediately after. A sense of helplessness crept in, the same overwhelming frustration he had felt just days ago. But despite everything, he had been the one to win back then. That thought alone strengthened his resolve. No matter how impossible it seemed, he would find a way, as long as he didn't give up. While holding his sword, Incrid suddenly removed Vengeance's blanket, which enraged Vengeance and made him think Incrid was acting irrational that day. Incrid guessed he had been wrong in assuming the assassins would have already infiltrated the base by that point. If they had not, then he needed to remain vigilant outside. Irritated, Vengeance asked if the day's training involved catching cockroaches with a sword. He then smirked and remarked that such an exercise seemed fitting for low-life soldiers. Incrid replied that he hadn't realized Vengeance cared so much about him. Taken aback, Vengeance clarified that he was being sarcastic. Incrid met his gaze, silently thinking to himself that he had been sarcastic as well. Moments later, Krang arrived and asked if the two were arguing again before questioning whether he should return later. However, Incrid assured him it was fine and told him to come in. Noting how closely the assassins observed Krang, Incrid was certain he was their target. Though suspicious of him, he wondered who Krang truly was. However, he decided not to pry into something the other party was unwilling to reveal without being asked, just like those crazed assassins. Still, because of Krang, Incrid had become entangled in the assassination plot. Given that, he figured it was reasonable to ask at least this much. Incrid called out to Krang and asked what he was. Krang paused for a moment, meeting Incrid's gaze. Seeing his reaction, Incrid wondered if he had phrased that poorly. Perhaps his conversational skills were on par with Rem's. After a brief silence, Krang finally spoke, considering Incrid's question carefully. Then, he answered that it wasn't something he could reveal. Incrid questioned why, to which Krang simply replied that it was a long story. If you say so. Incrid responded, his tone indifferent. His reply immediately irritated Vengeance. Frustrated, he snapped at Incrid, telling him that if he was just going to accept such an answer, he shouldn't have asked in the first place. Turning to Krang, Vengeance continued, stating that whatever he was, he clearly wasn't from this country. His damn manners made that obvious. He then demanded honesty, pressing Krang to admit which country's spy he was. At that, Krang slowly approached Vengeance, his voice steady as he declared that he had never betrayed the kingdom and never would. Incrid could see it, the way Krang moved, the look in his eyes. The presence he carried was unmistakable. It was the aura of a knight. However, Incrid remained certain. Krang was hiding something. As everyone prepared to sleep, Incrid wondered if Vengeance was afraid of Krang after their earlier exchange. He had been unusually calm. Gazing at the tent's entrance, Incrid considered the grim possibility. If the assassins barged in now, they would all die. Noticing Incrid rising from his bed, Vengeance frowned and asked what he was doing instead of sleeping. Without hesitation, Incrid stated that assassins would soon invade the tent and advised Vengeance to cooperate if he wanted to survive. Vengeance scoffed, dismissing the warning. "You've lost your mind," he muttered before turning over and going back to sleep. That was the reaction Incrid had expected. Suddenly, a needle tore through the tent's fabric, piercing Incrid's neck. Shocked, he barely had time to process it. When had they attacked? Before he could react, another strike hit Vengeance. Without hesitation, he rushed to Krang's bed and drove a sword through him, eliminating him in a single motion. Incrid could only watch helplessly as his body weakened. Darkness crept into his vision until, at last, he collapsed to the ground. For the fourth time, Incrid found himself in the same predicament. With no evidence of the assassin's approach, he was unable to seek help from Vengeance and Krang. Instead, he resolved to inform the higher-ups and request reinforcements. However, upon reporting the situation, his superior questioned his sanity, dismissing his concerns outright. Before Incrid could insist, he was ordered to leave or risk being silenced permanently. Left with no choice, he decided to anticipate the assassin's arrival and alert the others at the precise moment they appeared. Stationed at the entrance of the tent, he remained vigilant, ready to sound the alarm. But just as he was about to shout, a needle pierced his neck, paralyzing him before he could react. In an instant, the assassin slipped into the tent. To Incrid, they moved at an inhuman speed. Calling for help was no longer an option. His only chance was to launch a preemptive strike before they could act. However, a grim realization set in. How was he supposed to fight an enemy he couldn't even see? While his attackers had full visibility, he was left in the dark. As long as he remained unable to evade their poison-tipped needles, death was inevitable, and he would fall without a chance to resist. On the 20th morning, Incrid found himself in the same helpless situation once again. For the 20th time in a row, he had failed to do anything. Yet, a slow smile spread across his face as he realized that, despite everything, he had only died 20 times. This thought brought him a renewed sense of motivation. Incrid concluded that the first step was to find a way to avoid the poison needle. Once he figured that out, he could focus on how to deal with his attackers. As he pondered how to outpace their attacks, he noticed Jackson sitting nearby. His curiosity piqued, Incrid approached Rem and asked him why he had called Jackson a perverted wildcat. Rem explained that Jackson never faced his enemies directly. Instead, he preferred to backstab them and then flee. Incrid approached Jackson, who then asked his squad commander if his injuries were now healed. In Incrid's mind, he assumed Jackson would easily defeat the assassins. However, Incrid couldn't simply take Jackson with him, as he lacked the authority to do so. Even if he did, it would be a challenge that Incrid would have to overcome on his own. After a moment of thought, Incrid resolved that he would become Jackson. He then asked Jackson what someone like him would need to do in order to stop Jackson if he were to stab Incrid in the back. Jackson paused, considering the question, before admitting that he wasn't sure. No one had ever survived his ambushes. The response left Incrid stunned, his face betraying his shock. Seeing Incrid's reaction, Jackson sighed and exhaled. He told Incrid that he would need eyes on the back of his head. However, Incrid didn't understand and asked what he meant. Jackson then directed Incrid's attention to a wagon behind the tents. Incrid was surprised and wondered how Jackson had noticed something so far away. In his mind, he questioned whether Jackson truly had eyes on the back of his head. A moment later, Jackson predicted that the wagon was about to fall apart. To Incrid's shock, the wagon collapsed just as Jackson had said. Stunned, Incrid asked if Jackson was a prophet and demanded to know how he had known. Jackson simply pointed to his ear and explained that it was because of the sound. He had heard the creaking from the wagon's axle. He further elaborated that by listening carefully to one's surroundings, it was possible to predict what would happen next. Incrid couldn't believe that Jackson had heard something so quiet, especially when he himself hadn't even noticed the wagon approaching. Jackson explained that one didn't need to rely on sight to sense their surroundings. He added that by continuously listening and practicing, one could hone their senses and learn to isolate specific sounds. Incrid admitted that it was a good explanation but pointed out that Jackson had always seemed too lazy to even respond to him properly before. Jackson smirked and admitted that he was indeed lazy, but teaching Incrid was better than having him constantly on his heels. With a sigh, he added that, lately, it seemed like Incrid had no intention of giving up. Incrid had come across his second obstacle, an unseen death lurking in the shadows. He believed that if he could sense them, he might survive. The sound of regular footsteps, that was the patrol. The crackling of torches, ambient noise from the camp. Incrid focused, trying to pinpoint the presence of the approaching assassin. Where was that bastard sound? Of course, he failed. And once again, he died. Despite not taking a single step forward, his body remembered everything, the sensation of learning, the instincts of the hunt, and the pain of the fatal stab. Jackson advised him that sound alone could reveal a great deal of information. One could determine the location of something based on the intensity and direction of a sound. And once a person learned to perceive faint, distant noises, their ears might as well serve as a second pair of eyes. Suddenly, Jackson snapped his fingers, instantly putting Incrid on alert. Jackson took a breath and explained that sound was a wave, one that traveled in all directions, no matter how silent. In the chaotic blend of thousands of overlapping sound waves, the key was to isolate just one. Incrid began training his ability to distinguish individual sounds from the tangled web of overlapping sound waves. He needed to listen, categorize, and isolate each one. The flags, to him, they still sounded like a single large flag. He focused, trying to determine how many there actually were. Next, he turned his attention to the footsteps, attempting to count how many people were nearby, from right to left. He felt the vibrations of the waves, the familiar sounds and the unfamiliar ones, layering upon one another. Moments later, Krang approached and called out to him. Curious, Krang asked what kind of training Incrid was doing. Incrid scoffed, explaining that he was merely sitting there like an idiot and sarcastically asking if that looked like training to him. But Krang simply smiled, unconvinced. He assumed that Incrid was no fool who wasted time. The 33rd attempt, another failure. The 34th, still nothing. Incrid heard no change, only repeated failures. Experience was no longer the issue. He did not need divine intervention or sudden realization. He simply had to persist, to do what needed to be done. Krang silently approached, but just as he neared, Incrid's eyes snapped open, startling him. He had crept up unnoticed, yet somehow, Incrid had sensed him. Krang wondered how he had been detected but soon realized that Incrid had kept his eyes closed for some time. Understanding dawned. Incrid was training his perception. Krang smirked, acknowledging that Incrid was no fool who squandered time. Another night fell, and an assassin struck, hurling a needle toward Incrid's neck. But Incrid reacted swiftly, dodging the attack. Without hesitation, he drew the weapon he had concealed and swung at his assailant. The assassin, however, was just as quick, stepping back to evade the strike. A faint smile crossed Incrid's lips. This was no longer an unseen, faceless death. The assassin grew furious with Incrid's evasiveness and lunged at him. However, Incrid quickly assessed his opponent. This one wasn't nearly as skilled in combat as the stabbing pervert. He was confident he could handle him. But then his eyes flicked to the others. Vengeance had already collapsed, a needle embedded in his neck. Krang, however, was still alive, rising from his bed, hand reaching for his sword. Even so, Incrid knew better than to lower his guard. His opponent was still a trained assassin. Without hesitation, the assassin hurled a dagger. Incrid barely managed to evade it, but the blade tore through his clothing, leaving a shallow wound. Moments later, Incrid noticed a sword slicing through the tent's fabric. As the tear widened, the ferry company commander stepped inside. A single thought gripped Incrid's mind: if he didn't strike first, he would die. Without hesitation, he dashed toward her, aiming to stab. But before he could reach his target, the assassin let out a startled exclamation, realizing they had a guard. In an instant, he unleashed a flurry of needles at everyone around. The ferry commander reacted swiftly. She leapt over Incrid, her cape billowing out to catch the incoming needles, shielding those behind her. Incrid froze for a brief moment. He had assumed she was with the assassin, yet she had come to protect them. Whatever the truth was, he knew one thing: this was his chance. Repositioning himself, Incrid lunged at the assassin with a decisive stab. The assassin raised his weapon in defense, but the force of Incrid's strike sent it flying from his grip. Realizing he was at a disadvantage, the assassin wasted no time. He spun around and fled into the night. Krang expressed that the assassin was likely targeting him, to which Incrid responded that he knew. Krang then questioned how Incrid knew. In response, Incrid posed a question of his own: who would hire an assassin to kill someone as insignificant as him rather than vengeance? The fairy agreed with Incrid, affirming his reasoning with a simple "exactly." She then remarked on Incrid's quick reflexes before gripping her sword, preparing to unsheath it. At that moment, Incrid realized that, until now, she had been an ally, but it seemed she could not allow this information to be revealed. If she was unwilling to leave any witnesses, Incrid had no choice but to ready his weapon in defense. Before a fight could break out, Krang suddenly stepped between them and addressed the fairy. He told her he had a favor to ask and stated firmly that he did not want anyone to die today. The fairy bowed in acknowledgement and obeyed his request. Krang then added that this extended to the platoon commander as well, motioning toward vengeance, knowing full well that he was still alive. The fairy responded that they had the antidote, so he would be fine. Now, they needed to clean up the mess. It would be a problem if anyone discovered that an assassin had been there. Incrid questioned whether it would be fine as long as no traces were left behind. He then glanced at the candle and remarked that there was an easy solution. Moments later, flames erupted from the medical tent, quickly engulfing it. The surrounding soldiers rushed toward the fire, frantically carrying buckets of water in an attempt to extinguish the blaze. As the flames raged, they spotted two survivors emerging from the chaos. In Incrid's mind, the traces of the assassin had been erased. With that, he left the others to handle the aftermath. As they walked beneath the bright night sky, the fairy remarked that if the squad leader hadn't slowed the assassin down, Krang would have died. She then asked if Incrid had influenced Krang's change of mind. Krang admitted that he had and that he found Incrid interesting. He had been trying to avoid it, but in the end, he couldn't deny it. With a slight smile, he remarked that Incrid must have rubbed off on him. Moving forward, Krang expressed his desire to meet Incrid again, this time in their respective roles. In the other dimension, a scythe slowly began to fade away. The unknown creature then told Incrid that he would see Krang again. Incrid simply responded with a single word, anytime. Once again, he was confronted by the endlessly repeating, today. He had survived that silent death and awakened to the morning of the next cycle. Though he could sense the presence of most things, the fairy remained undetectable. There was much to do once he returned. Fortunately, he was unharmed, allowing him to set out immediately. Vengeance questioned Incrid about why he had saved him from the fire. In Incrid's mind, he wondered if Vengeance was giving him grief for saving him now and why he disliked him so much. Incrid then replied that he did it because they were comrades and asked if any other reason was necessary. Vengeance was unable to respond and could only watch as Incrid walked away. Under his breath, he muttered that after all the trouble he had given Incrid, the man still saved him. He then called Incrid a selfless bastard. Suddenly, Vengeance stood up and asked if Incrid was returning to his squad, to which Incrid simply replied, yes. Vengeance scoffed and told him he was out of luck, explaining that the atmosphere was going to be miserable out there. Incrid furrowed his brows and asked if something had happened. Vengeance answered that a rumor was spreading, one that claimed the entire base was cursed. On the other side of the base, Ragna and Rem had started a fight. The people around them quickly scattered, searching for their squad leader, knowing that this was happening only because he wasn't there to keep them in check. Incrid arrived, and in his mind, he didn't know whether the base was truly cursed, but those bastards might as well be his personal curse. Without hesitation, he approached them and ordered them to stop. Ragna and Rem froze, their eyes widening in shock. They had believed their squad leader was dead. 4 days had passed since Incrid returned to his squad. He suddenly opened his eyes when Jackson attempted to leave quietly. Seeing this, Jackson asked if he had woken Incrid up. Incrid shook his head and replied that he was going to wake up and work out anyway. Jackson noted that although Incrid had only started recently, he was already quite good at listening. Incrid explained that he had been practicing. In response, Jackson encouraged him to keep it up, assuring him that it would prove useful someday. Battles are scarce, especially with winter approaching. Incrid takes advantage of the extra time by dedicating himself to training. After his workout, Auden greets his squad leader with a polite, good morning. Noticing Incrid's consistent effort, Auden inquires if he is returning from his morning exercises. He acknowledges Incrid's dedication, remarking that a well-trained body is a weapon in itself. With a playful smile, Auden jokes that Incrid should at least be able to withstand a kick from a frog. However, observing Incrid's slender frame, he advises him to continue training. Inwardly, Incrid wonders if Auden is simply excessively large. Nevertheless, he responds with a determined nod, assuring that he will keep trying. Meanwhile, Rem flipped Ragna's bed and reminded him that it was his turn for duty. However, Ragna remained asleep, prompting Rem to call him a lazy bastard. Annoyed, Ragna crawled toward his weapon and attempted to strike Rem, who, in turn, prepared to counter with his axe. Before the clash could escalate, Incrid and Auden arrived, questioning whether they were fighting again. Incrid urged them to stand down, while Auden clutched a small cross and remarked that wanton violence solves nothing. Pointing at Ragna, Rem scoffed, claiming that the directionally challenged fool was going to starve them. Incrid then turned to Ragna and reminded him that if it was his turn for duty, he should start cooking. With a resigned sigh, Ragna responded, "If you say so, squad leader." Holding his towel, Rem told Ragna there was no need for such dramatics if he was going to do it anyway. In response, Ragna shoved Rem aside and told him to back off, complaining about his smell. Curious, Rem sniffed his towel and insisted that it actually smelled good. Incrid sighed and told him to stop picking fights for no reason before asking if he was simply bored. With a grin, Rem asked if Incrid had noticed. He admitted that the lack of battles was making him restless. Incrid, unfazed, warned him not to take out his frustration on random people. Instead, he extended an invitation for a duel, offering Rem a more productive way to channel his energy. Incrid and Rem began their duel. Keeping his composure, Incrid focused on the heart of the beast, relying on his heightened hearing to anticipate and block attacks. And then, the technique he had practiced through countless near-deaths, the stab. Rem swiftly dodged the attack, catching Incrid's sword with his axe. With his free hand, he grabbed Incrid's shirt and effortlessly slammed him to the ground. Disappointed, Rem sighed. He had expected more, given how much Incrid had improved recently. He then questioned why Incrid had suddenly become so predictable, expressing boredom at seeing the same move yet again. Demanding something new, he urged Incrid to surprise him. But now, Incrid understood, he was different than before. He could repeat the same actions not just hundreds, but thousands of times, pushing forward no matter what. With confidence, Incrid told Rem to come at him again, vowing to properly defeat him this time. In Rem's mind, he knew that Incrid's skills were still lacking, yet, for some reason, he never grew tired of watching those determined eyes. Smirking, Rem replied that Incrid could talk big, after he managed to leave even a dent. Before their duel could continue, the rain began to pour, forcing everyone to retreat to their tents. While the other squad members rested, Incrid sat quietly, watching the rain start and stop at its own will. Suddenly, cries stormed in, grumbling about how many times he had to cancel his duels because of the weather. He even joked that he wouldn't be surprised if someone claimed they were cursed. Curious, Incrid asked what curse Cries was referring to. Cries looked at his squad leader with disbelief and questioned whether he hadn't heard the rumors. Now that Incrid thought about it, Vengeance had mentioned something before, something about their encampment being cursed. Cries remarked that the weather had been behaving strangely. Casualties continued to rise, with many suffering burns, especially those in the scout squad, where nearly everyone was injured. Rumors spread that they were cursed, but he insisted that such claims were unfounded. The unpredictable weather only fueled the speculation. Incrid then noted that the higher-ups would not ignore such incidents. Cries, noticing Incrid standing at the entrance, questioned his reason for being there. Incrid explained that he was training his senses. Cries, puzzled, asked if he was doing so in the middle of a downpour. Incrid simply responded that it was precisely because of the downpour. Wrapped in a blanket, Rem turned to Incrid and asked if he was a stray cat, questioning the purpose of such training. Jackson interjected, remarking that it was not a bad way to train and that Incrid was doing well. However, Rem, visibly irritated, turned to Jackson and demanded to know what he had been teaching Incrid and since when he had taken an interest in their squad leader. Auden suggested that if Incrid was looking for a way to train indoors, there were exercises he could do even while lying down. Ragna also offered to evaluate Incrid's stance once more. Rem observed everyone around him, a smile on his face as he wondered if they had all noticed what he had. He questioned to himself whether he was right in thinking they had noticed the same thing. Meanwhile, in another tent, the company commanders were instructed to maintain discipline among their soldiers. Plans were being made to send out a scouting party before the onset of winter, and the commanders asked if anyone had suggestions to address any gaps in their preparations. It was then that the Fairy suggested considering the 444th squad leader. Their leader, skeptical, asked if the Fairy was referring to the seemingly useless individual whom he deemed somewhat dim-witted. He expressed concern about the possibility of that person hindering the scouts' efforts. However, the Fairy confidently countered, suggesting that the individual might yield unexpected results. When asked to elaborate on this instinct, the Fairy simply replied, "It's just a fairy's instinct." By morning, Incrid was summoned to the Fairy's office, where he was informed that he would be sent with the scouts. When Incrid returned to the tent, he was immediately asked if he had done something to anger the company commander. In response, he questioned what he could have possibly done to warrant such a reaction. Cries pressed further, asking why else the Fairy would have chosen him specifically. Incrid's thoughts drifted to the Fairy, wondering if she intended to kill him now that Krang was gone. As he packed his belongings, Rem approached and asked if he was really going through with it. He offered to help him get out of the situation, but Incrid replied that it wasn't as if he could simply use that axe on his superior, unlike Rem. Rem assured him that he would never suggest such a thing. Incrid, however, cautioned him not to attempt it either, reminding him that he had a history of such actions. Meanwhile, Auden knelt in prayer, pleading for understanding. He asked why the father tested his poor servants and begged him not to take their precious squad leader away. Witnessing this, Incrid couldn't help but wonder what had gotten into them. Just then, Ragna rose from his bed and offered to go in Incrid's place. Incrid, however, dismissed the idea outright, saying that perhaps someone else could take his place, but not Ragna. Jackson then spoke up, asking if it was true that Incrid was being sent to scout the tall grass fields. He advised him to pay close attention to the changes in the sound of the grass, as disturbances in the rustling were the first sign of an impending ambush. At this, Rem scoffed and shouted, calling Jackson a sneaky bastard for trying to teach Incrid again. He reminded him to stop filling their squad leader's head with strange ideas. Incrid sighed, realizing that once he was gone, nothing would stop them from fighting each other. A lingering doubt crept into his mind. Was it really the right decision to leave them behind? Yet, deep down, even he had to admit that no one was better suited for this task than himself. After enlisting, Incrid's lackluster skills led to him being constantly reassigned, filling in wherever an extra hand was needed. The only place where he finally proved useful was as the leader of a squad made up of misfits and leftovers. When Rem and Jackson were about to come to blows, Incrid stepped between them without hesitation, unfazed by the tension. He firmly told them to cut it out. Rem scoffed and questioned whether their squad leader was brave or just plain stupid. Jackson, turning his back, remarked that Rem should be grateful. If not for Incrid, he would have ended up with another hole in his heart. Rem, unimpressed, fired back that Jackson's head would have hit the ground first. Incrid observed them, thinking that despite their constant bickering, these goons were truly skilled. They couldn't afford to lose any of them. Compared to them, his absence wouldn't be much of a loss in terms of combat power. But there was no need for such sudden contemplation. He already knew where he stood when it came to skill. He just needed to improve. The scouts would be heading to the front lines, giving him the perfect opportunity to focus on sharpening his senses. Scout squad leader Andrew sneered as he called out to Incrid, addressing him as the leftover squad leader, and telling him to focus. With a sharp tone, he reminded Incrid that while they shared the same rank, he was the one leading this scout squad. If Incrid had a problem with that, they could settle it with a fight. One of Andrew's comrades laughed, mocking the idea. He questioned whether Incrid even had the guts to fight, considering he belonged to the outcast squad. Another scoffed, pointing at Incrid and calling him a dumb fool, asking if he even knew how to hold a sword properly. Andrew smirked and added that if Incrid did decide to challenge him, he would at least try not to hurt him too badly. He then dismissed him outright, calling him a useless bastard and claiming that the only reason Incrid's squad even functioned was because of his subordinates. Turning back to his own squad, Andrew barked orders, telling them to listen up. If we run into the enemy, he shouted, we bash their skulls in. The scout members roared their approval in unison. In Incrid's mind, they were unbearably loud. Did they not understand what scouting was supposed to mean? He questioned whether their so-called leader had any clue what he was doing. Andrew was completely green. Would this mission even end well? As they continued on their path, they stumbled upon a set of tracks. Andrew took one look and confidently declared them to be new tracks. Grinning, he turned to his squad and announced that they would follow the trail and have a barbecue tonight. Incrid silently analyzed the situation. New traveled in groups of at least 20. Was Andrew seriously planning to fight that many? What was even going on inside his head? Henri, the squad's archer, smirked in disbelief. He scoffed at Andrew's conclusion and insisted that the tracks belonged to a gazelle, not a gnu. Then, turning to Incrid, he muttered, that scout leader of ours is kinda obnoxious, don't you think? Formerly a hunter in a mountain town, Henri showed little concern for the squad leader. Instead, he engaged in conversation with Incrid, and the two quickly grew close. Henri shared the fundamentals of hunting, which Incrid found highly valuable. They spent the entire day searching for news that were nowhere to be found, ultimately wasting the scout squad's efforts. Meanwhile, Andrew remained unsettled, convinced that the tracks he had seen belonged to a gnu. He scratched his head, troubled by the need to produce results, anything at all. As morning arrived, the squad resumed their march until they reached their designated reconnaissance point, the Green Pearl, also known as the uselessly tall grass field. Andrew ordered them to cross the dense grassland, locate the hostile scouting party, capture them as prisoners, and claim their reward. Henri hesitated, questioning whether they were truly meant to proceed, as their mission had only been to scout the area. Incrid simply replied that it was the squad leader's command. Navigating through the towering grass was no easy task, and Incrid soon felt the urge to give up. However, what truly surprised him was Andrew's uncharacteristic silence. For once, he wasn't complaining, he was taking this mission seriously. Henri remarked that there were very few animal droppings, a detail that piqued Incrid's curiosity. When Incrid asked if that was a problem, Henri explained that it indicated the absence of animals in a place where food should be plentiful, an unsettling sign. Moments later, a black panther appeared suddenly in front of them. Realizing the imminent danger, Incrid urgently signaled for everyone to drop to the ground. However, it was too late. Several of the squad members were struck by arrows, the projectiles piercing their heads with lethal precision. In that instant, Andrew recognized the situation for what it was, an ambush. He ordered everyone to run, but one by one, they were captured or eliminated. Amid the chaos, Incrid, determined to survive, attempted to escape the deadly field, hoping for a chance to outrun the danger.